The visionary TV executive Sir Jeremy Isaacs started Channel 4 and also presided at the Royal Opera House through the period of its rebuilding. Building things is what the great and good once did. He may be the last of a breed, the barons of the arts, who truly loved what they were doing. Jeremy, when your mother sang in the synagogue, she could hold a note.
She sang loud and clear and held the note one beat longer than anybody else, so you knew she was there.
But you weren't a singer yourself.
I was so awful a singer, according to those who had to listen to me and to my teachers, that I was one of those in the class who was told to. We were called specials, and when any guy wanted the whole class to sing in tune, the music teacher wanted the whole class to sing in tune, you would say, "Specials, keep quiet this time." And then two or three of us that couldn't sing in tune, shut up. Then
you were so bad, you spread badness to others.
I said, I and others, but I mean, I remember the occasion of my bar mitzvah, I was terribly full of myself, so full of myself that I lost the place. I was glancing round the upper galleries of a synagogue, to look at the girls and be sure that they were looking at me. I lost the place, and my grandfather, who was a minister, all 5 foot of him, was standing beside me with with a beautiful silver pencil pointing at the Hebrew script on the scroll of the law, and that got me back onto it. But anyway, I accomplished this feat of singing that, and then in the great chunk of the prophets that you sing along with it, after it, and I thought I'd been a triumph. I simply didn't realize that I couldn't sing a note in tune. Then I heard that somebody had said, terrific performance, but what a pity he can't sing in tune. Then I realized.
Well, there's a lot like that with me. It doesn't come out, but it sure does come in. I couldn't imagine anyone being more sensitive to the sound of music than myself, except when I read you, and I can tell that you loved it from the first day, didn't you?
I loved. Yes, my parents had music in the house, is what it came to. My mother sang. She sang Burlington Bertie from Bow in the cabaret at Glasgow University. She was a medical student, went up in 1918, when half the intake were women because of the slaughter of the First World War. And they had a few records. But they were kind of Chabrier's Espagne, Gally Kirchy singing Lo Here the Gentle Lark, and that sort of thing. And I remember they were so proud of the gramophone that they would offer to put a record on when friends came to visit. And one very austere scholar said, "Don't you have anything less, less syrupy?" But still, they had music in the home, and she, bless her cotton socks, took me to concerts, me and my brothers to concerts on Sunday afternoons, and then bought us the season tickets that enabled us to go every Saturday night. And
Glasgow was a very musical town in those days.
Well, it had a great concert hall, and it had an orchestra. The concert hall burnt down some years later when some people at a boxing match left something under the seat that they shouldn't have done. But before that, it was called St Andrews Halls, and it was one of the old cigar box-shaped concert halls that the great Victorian cities had. And Glasgow, of course, was one of the great Victorian cities of Europe, the second city of the empire, perhaps. Dublin would have claimed that, perhaps, probably. And we had an orchestra, and the orchestra was pretty good. I mean, it was agony to wait for the entry of the horns if you knew it was coming. And I once remember a performance of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto by Claudio Arrau, because the great stars, 20 great pianists a year came to Glasgow. But in Brahms 2, he had to play, with the solo cello, and there was a great deal of horn, and I was in agony on his behalf as the cello scraped, but he was very gallant about it. In the end of the performance, he went up and shook the cellist's hand. But the thing that happened is that because at an age which I couldn't identify, I came to the conclusion that yes, there was football and cricket, and yes, there would be girls, but actually what I should do with my life was see as many paintings, listen to as many symphonies, read as many books as possible. And actually the thing I did before any music and anything else was read. But I just couldn't get enough of it, and I thought the day is wasted unless I've done a lot of that, and that my time is wasted if I'm not doing one of those things.
We've got to face the question of whether there are any young people now who feel like that.
Well, what I realise about me is, you see, that all the things that young people who are now older people, you know, and are harking back to their youth of pop and rock, what they're talking about is an experience that escaped me completely because, yes, I liked some pop music very much, but the pop music I heard, there was a wonderful radio program which I used to hear on Saturday afternoons at 6:30, which was called Jack. Well, there must have been two programs. One began with Joe Loss and his band live playing "In the Mood." Now that's got to get, you know, da 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 that. And then there was a guy called Jack Jackson and his record roundup. And what he was a real original. And there's nobody that I'm aware of like him on the radio today. But the records that he picked were from a wide-ranging, eclectic choice of folk and Pee Wee Hunt and Phil Harris and all sorts of people. And those I love. But the moment it began to get homogenized, I just ignored it.
So you're saying you're listening to good pop?
I thought I was listening to good pop and I didn't need bad pop.
What about the Edinburgh Festival? You couldn't get there by bus from Glasgow.
We went by train. We went from Queen Street Station. It cost 5 shillings for a cheap day return. We had packed lunches, 3 of us. We used to. The festival program would come out in February, March, and we wrote away. We went through it, and we wrote away for tickets. And what we were looking for, in order to get the best possible value out of the 5 shilling day return, were days on which we could enjoyably go to 3 performances before we came home. So we'd get there in time for chamber music in the Freemasons Hall on George Street at 11. You could get there, of course, in 45 minutes, 50 minutes. We've got a 9:30 train, bags of time for the 11 o'clock chamber music. Then there would be something in the afternoon, which might be at the Usher Hall or might be at the Lyceum Theatre. I heard The Winter's Tale. I say heard, although I actually saw The Winter's Tale, because I was sitting at the end of a row in the upper circle, and I heard a voice underneath me, and that was John Gielgud, and that was the first time I heard Gielgud. So I heard him before I saw him. And then in the evening, it was either the big stuff at the Usher Hall, Bruno Walter with the New York Philharmonic, Irmgard Seyfried wearing a wonderful décolletage with fantastic sunburn,
Girls.
and something to show off with
Singing
her sunburn,
girls.
singing of, and or it was the opera in the King's Theatre, which was absolutely tiny, quite hopeless from the point of view of major productions, but nevertheless...
It sometimes helps, doesn't it?
It helps. I mean, it was so close that it wasn't till years and years and years later when I got to go to Glyndebourne, because it was Glyndebourne I principally heard in Edinburgh, that opera spoke to me intimately like that music did. That was joy. And we danced. We ran and danced at the same time down the hill to the Haymarket station from the King's Theatre to catch the train back to Glasgow.
So the opera was the thing once you started seeing it.
I think so. I mean, yes, it was. And we heard marvellous recitals and marvellous symphony concerts. I saw Furtwängler do the Beethoven 3 and 4 and other things. And I heard Kathleen Ferrier sing Das Lied von der Erde under Bruno Walter, and a French woman in the Usher Hall behind me said, you know, formidable. And that got to me. But certainly, the love of opera that I have started in Edinburgh. And it hurts a Glaswegian to say that, because I would like to say that it started in Glasgow, but I think I can't.
You're one of those undergraduates who goes up to Oxford already knowing everything you need to know when you come down. So what did you actually do?
Oh, no, on the contrary. I mean, I went to Oxford, and it was like the biggest box of toys, the biggest... The most lavish table spread with a feast that you can imagine. Because Glasgow was not. I mean, Edinburgh, you know, claimed to be the Athens of North. Ken Tynan said it was the Trondheim of the Southwest. Glasgow cared, and Glasgow was a great city, but it was limited, and society was limited, and so on. But here I was in Oxford, where there were poetry societies and film societies and theatre clubs, wonderful lectures by great teachers. I heard Isaac Berlin, And there was politics and debating and so on. So the day was absolutely crowded, and I think that would have been unimaginable if I'd gone where everybody else I knew went, to Glasgow University, because a university in the middle of a city, which is not a residential university, where everybody lives at different corners of the perimeter of the city, and has to get back there somehow in the evening, is not the same thing as somewhere where you can stay up all night chatting away with everybody you know and love.
Today, someone with your tastes, loves, indeed passions, and most of them very learned, would probably be warned off television, and I think at last lately with some reason. But for a long, long time that wasn't true. The television built a great beneficial system of giving arts to the people, and it was starting to do that in a big way when you went into it. Did you see that coming? Did you wanted to contribute to it? Did you see that as part of a mission?
Well, the mission that took me in, which I saw happening and made me ring up and say, please, was a mission that a man called Sidney Bernstein had, who was the owner and boss of Granada.
I remember him well. He wanted me to cut my beard off. And he was right.
He was a very strange man, though. I mean, he wanted to know, what shoes you were wearing and that kind of thing. And when I auditioned Michael Heseltine for him to present a current affairs program, he made him get up out of his seat and walk around the studio so he could see how he walked. But Sidney had a belief that the public was entitled to know what was going on in the society which they as citizens ought to control. And so he wanted to use television to educate them in that.
He's a very cultivated man.
Yes, yes. He bought paintings and hung the studios with paintings.
Just jumping forward a bit, I'm bound to say I came in on the tail end of this, and I'm bound to say I thought it was always going to be like this, that the great and good would be in charge of TV, and it would fulfill its divine mission.
But do you think, Clive, that we were entitled to believe that was the way it should be? I mean, I would say, that there was, I would now concede that although I wouldn't diminish by a whit my love of and admiration for the great minds or pens that I encountered, or the great musicians, there was a snobbishness in that attitude which consisted of saying that there wasn't really anything else that was worth bothering about. The popular culture just didn't matter very much. And it wasn't until Hoggart came along and wrote that book, The Uses of Literacy, and, that one began to see that the culture that I thought was culture was actually just a culture, however admirable, desirable, still refreshing and sustaining, among several, and that others were going to want to look in one day. And I think that what television was doing in those days was, although it was in the hands, to an extent, of mandarins, what ITV forced the BBC to do was to realize that if they wanted to reach everybody in the society, they had to provide the entertainment that everybody would enjoy. And I was there when ITV launched its onslaught on the BBC, and the BBC brilliantly, under Hugh Green, the greatest broadcasting executive of the second half of the century, pretty well of the century, he unleashed the BBC in response by tapping, in a way that ITV was not really capable of doing, the creative talents of writers, comedians, and that was the work that one remembers and was knocked over by. The Wednesday play, Z-Cars, the comedies of Gordon and Simpson and so on and so forth.
You yourself had a pretty wide range as you moved up the production ladder. At Thames, some of the programs that when we look back on, it wasn't Rock Follies and things like that were happening under your...
Yes, because I had the good fortune. I mean, first of all, ITV was told, you may have 70% of the audience. The BBC would hit back and make it 55 to ITV. They were told by the regulators, you guys are making absolute fortunes. You're printing money. You've got 55% of the audience. Now, for heaven's sake, use the position that you have to extend the range of possibilities that you're offering viewers. And they began, first of all, by doing it with one-offs that were complete and utter exceptions to the general run of the station. You know, I mean, Rediffusion boasted of a drama in Greek called Icon Vesicles or something, you know, which was directed by a lovely woman, a very able one called Joan Kemp Welsh. But it was a complete and total one-off. Or they would do Frankie Howard as Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream or something. But they were told, no, that's not enough. We need one quiz game less and one and more good, serious drama. And I was actually asked, when I became director, so there was then an ambition that on ITV's part that its news, which was always a bit of a pioneer but never had much space, that its current affairs was only 1 or maybe 2 half hours a week, that they should be at least as good as anything the BBC could do, and if possible better. And it was because of what I did in Rediffusion's current affairs programme this week that I was asked to go to the BBC and do Panorama, which I didn't get right, and so on.
It seemed to me that there was a fruitful contest between BBC and ITV, which could have gone on forever, but the rules were changed radically under the Thatcher government when the quality requirements were removed from the ITV franchise bids.
That's right.
Now, the moment the ITV didn't have to do something high quality to get the franchise, it didn't do it.
You got it.
And down it went, and the BBC chased it,
yeah.
which the BBC didn't have to do.
I was asked by the chairman of the company, Thames, to spend more money on programmes. We're making so much money, we're doing pretty well, but we've got to make it more evident that we're spending more money on programmes. Thence Edward and Mrs. Simpson, Rock Follies, Howard Schuman's Rock Follies, Trevor Griffith's Bill Brand, you know, Philip Mackey's The Naked Civil Servant. I had the great good fortune when I was made director of programmes at Thames in something like, in 74, I think, that Thames had just been told by ITV, or the ITEA, or whatever it's called, the regulatory body, you guys have done an absolutely terrific job and it's too good. You're too successful. Please take more risks. And I got to be director of programmes. I hired Verity Lambert to run drama, and her nose and her judgment gave us Rock Follies and Bill Brand.
I think The Naked Civil Servant remains to this day the single most original and amazing television programme.
It's the best script, Clive, I've ever read, you know, because it was a script that couldn't be done on the say-so of the head of drama, and indeed it couldn't even be done on my say-so. I had to say to the managing director, you know, we're going to do this, and you guys are going to be proud of it. But it was Philip Mackey's script, which had been hawked round the television companies and hawked up and down Wardour Street, and nobody would do it, was the single most perfectly version of a thing that I've seen. And Jack Gold got it absolutely dead right.
He's a stunning director. It gives me an excuse to jump straight through to Channel 4.
And John Hurt, at the party in my house to celebrate its winning the Prix Italia, felt my bottom.
Inspired by the film, no doubt.
Yeah.
It gives me a cue to jump straight through to Channel 4, because that kind of originality was what Channel 4 was meant to do, wasn't it?
Yes.
Something that nobody else was doing.
Something that nobody else was doing, yet I knew with a part of me that was heard by me that without a certain level of audience, you know, we would die. Also, I knew that if you ask people who work in television, or who think they want to work in television, that what you want is something that nobody else is doing, you won't be surprised for me to tell you that what you get is actually, you know, not very surprising. I mean, I made a speech to the independent producers and said, I don't want ideas that have gathered dust on the shelf. You know, don't think you can just dust the dust off and shove it at me. I don't want that. I want something absolutely new. Of thousands of ideas, and I mean pretty well, certainly hundreds of ideas, that is to say, of specific program proposals that we received, less than half a dozen seem to me original in the sense that you intend, and that you're right, the channel was there to do, and some of the originality of those was sat on by people in a position to sit on them, you know, as they got underway.
Well, you built it and you hit your audience figure, and when you left, you told Michael Gray that if he screwed it up, you'd kill him.
Yes.
But Michael Gray did not say this to Michael Jackson. and the last time I looked at Channel 4, I think it was about midnight on a Thursday night, I thought it was a bad night in the Weimar Republic. I thought I don't really need to know that much about sex. I already know. Or if I don't know, I don't know that much. I don't want to know that.
Quite. Well, they can't stop. Well, they can't. They just don't know how to stop. They're not any longer doing quite the sort of Friday night, late night sleaze that accumulated there for an hour and a half or 2 hours in many weeks in Michael Gray's time. But
ITV is doing it now.
They're
Channel 4
doing
doesn't have to.
Don't have to.
But
I mean,
if when ITV does Club Reps, then Channel 4's got nowhere to go.
Well, I couldn't.
You haven't
see,
seen
I
Club
wouldn't
Reps.
watch.
I can tell you haven't seen Club Reps.
No, of course I haven't. I've got better things to do. But I took part the other day in a discussion on censorship at the British Library, apropos of a great world encyclopedia of censorship that's just coming out. And I was remembering, and I actually do think that in measurable ways, the tolerance, or the range that is publishable on telly has altered dramatically. I make no value judgment about this, not necessarily altogether for anybody's good, in a couple of ways that are particularly evident this time. One of them, of course, is sex. At Thames, I had a series which I never got on the air called Sex in Our Time. It was as straightforward and simple as could be. Obviously, the episode, which I regretted, shot in Soho about the sex industry was sleazy and tits and bums, and it couldn't really be anything else. And I'd said to the guys, what on earth did you make my task difficult for by doing 1 out of 6 there? But they had done. But the thing that really got the regulators, the censors, goat, was women sitting around talking about their bodies and looking at a diagram of a vagina. And that sequence got the series banned. Sorry, we won't do it. We won't allow it. Don't do it. But the other night, they had a program on called Designer Vagina.
Yes, they did indeed.
Which again, you probably watched, Clive.
I didn't watch
it, but I didn't watch it. Anyway, the other thing is Northern Ireland. The great example of what could not be broadcast in Britain for 30-odd years was Northern Ireland. Because there was
you did a series about it once, historic.
Well, I did a history of Ireland, but I'm talking about the current affairs attempt to report there. Nobody reported the situation in Northern Ireland for decades. BBC Northern Ireland was a Stalinist fiefdom within a Stalinist central system, and they had a veto on any BBC coverage of Northern Ireland, so that you couldn't do it unless the Controller of Northern Ireland approved. ITV was a bit looser, but when we sent guys over there to report the Protestant ascendancy and why, this is before '68, before the more recent ruckuses and troubles started. Ulster Television either tried to stop us in the person of an extraordinary figure, the managing director, Brum Henderson, who was a very big man, and picked up a very big reporter, whom you probably know, called Godfrey Hodgson, and nearly threw him against the wall in the boardroom of Ulster Television, because he said, what the hell are you doing here? Why don't you leave us to, report on our own affairs? You've no right to be here. And when Bloody Sunday happened, and I was in charge of current affairs at Thames, the chairman of Thames tried to stop us on the following Thursday for this week reporting anything about it. He was a lawyer, and he argued, it's going to be sub judice. I don't trust you guys to get it right, so just, stay out of it. And although I had the best reporter on Ireland in British television, he was hamstrung in what he had to do that week. But today, you've at last got, by a sort of will of the broadcaster, to report what's going on there, or what did go on there.
You obviously, you were, all the time, you had your own channel. There was only really one big position to go to. And then you were offered Covent Garden. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were actually offered the job, and then suddenly the possibility that you might be Director General of the BBC opened.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. I was offered the job. To clinch the job, I had to go and have a drink with the chairman, John Sainsbury. I wanted to be absolutely certain.
This is Covent Garden. Yeah.
Covent Garden, that he could work with me. On the afternoon before, 2 in the afternoon, when I was due to see him at 6, somebody stuck their head round the door and said Alistair Milne has been fired and there's a vacancy at the BBC. And I didn't pay any attention because I was going to see him and to talk about the Opera House. But that was maybe a Thursday. Before the weekend, the phone was ringing and the papers were running the odds on the candidates, and people were saying to me, "Come on, Jeremy."
If I'd known your phone number, I would have been ringing too, saying, "For God's sake, go for it."
Has to go in. But I wouldn't necessarily have been a very good Director General of the BBC Club because it's a gigantic job, and you need all sorts of strengths and insights, managerial insights, for example, that I, may not necessarily possess.
Let's say that a love of programs and a real desire to do remarkable things helps.
I would have had that on my banner. That's right, and I would have worked with. I told the Board of Governors at the interview that I would work with Michael Checkland, who because he could do the sums, but of course he got the Director Generalship because they weren't going to have me, as was evident during the interview. And where a Scots trade unionist, John Boyd, who had been the General Secretary and was now the President of the Amalgamated Engineering Workers, he said to me, "Mr. Isaacs," he was a Salvation Army man, by the way, he said, "Mr. Isaacs," he said, "some of us here have the impression that you don't take very kindly to discipline. Now, I see by the smile on your face that you take that as a compliment, but I can assure you that I and others here see it as a criticism."
And that was
I was dead, yes.
And that was it. But you weren't. You went to Covent Garden. That's another story. We should do another program about that. For now, I have to say thank you very much.
It was an absolute pleasure to be with you.